Biden could have stopped it, and Zelensky could have stopped it, and Putin should have never started it. Everybody's to blame.
Have you spoken to President Zelensky, sir, about his offer to purchase more Patriot missile batteries?
Oh, I don't know. He's always looking to purchase missiles. You know, he's against. Listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size, and then hope that people give you some missiles.
That was President Trump just a few hours ago. Actually, that was made while we were on the air last. When we were talking about the Russia-Ukraine war with Colonel Jacques Beau. I recommend you go and watch that video. It's got some great stuff in there. He had some tremendous insights that really show a lot about what's going on. But what President Trump said there basically reinforced a lot of the fundamentals that we discussed there. And it sounds like that we're on the same page and the same sheet of music as the president is on this. And that is, listen, this war it's done. It's off. The decision is already made. The decision is already reached. The Ukraine side lost, the Russian side won. The only question outstanding now, how much worse will the end be? And as we talked about several times, there's a deal to be had on the table right now that Zelensky can agree to, that presumably, from what's being reported publicly anyway, that Trump has said, I'm going to offer a detailed settlement that we can get the war over with. They haven't released any of the terms of it yet, even what they're trying to negotiate with Russia, only that they're talking. But whatever they are, I can just tell you that they will be ugly for the Ukraine side. They will be probably very ugly for the Ukraine side. And it's going to be something that's almost nobody in Ukraine and even fewer in Europe are going to want to stomach. But the alternative is that Trump's patience runs out and that he ends up just saying, you know what? I gave it my best chance. This was Biden's war. He's the one that started this. He spent 3 years bypassing every opportunity to have peace that there was. And I'm not going to do the same. I'm not going to continue to function and to facilitate and to support a war that can't win when all it'll do is just keep it going longer and make sure more Ukrainian men die. I think that he's getting close to the point to where he's going to say, that's just it. You guys are on your own, or you take the ugly deal, because you either get the ugly negotiated deal or you get a horrific, flat out military defeat the other way. Don't know how much longer that would take, but just looking at reality on the ground and the military fundamentals, it's virtually as certain that Ukraine will get ground to nothing and end up dying. I also thought it was really interesting there at the end of that comment that Trump said, listen, you don't go against somebody who's 20 times higher than you and then wonder if you're going to get some missiles later. I can't help but remember this passage from the Bible in Luke 14:31-32, where Jesus himself says, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for terms of peace. And you know, Jesus said that because it was so self-evident. He was using that as a vehicle to make a bigger spiritual truth. But he used that vehicle because it's so obvious that that's what any rational person would do. And yet, as President Trump just pointed out there, and we've actually said a number of times, that is not what the Ukraine side did. And even now, all this time later, he still won't deal with reality and continues to go down a path of, now probably it's, instead of the example from Jesus there of 10,000 and 20,000, it's probably 1 to 20, like the President Trump said there a second ago. That's probably more accurate to the actual disparity between the two. And instead, he just won't make the obvious, logical, rational decision. And his countrymen continue to pay the price for it every day. And that is egregious. It hurts my soul. I try to put on a good face on it here. I try to keep it professional, but I promise you that it is a constant albatross around my neck and just sore anxiety that it causes me, just because I care about people. I care more about the Ukrainian people, I think, than most of these alleged supporters throughout the West and the others in the previous administration claimed to care about them. And yet everything they did made sure more Ukrainians got killed without the possibility of having a victory and a success. But that's kind of where we are, whether I like it or not. That's just the reality of it. It's just hard to imagine there could be this much disconnection from reality throughout the entire Western world. But we'll see if that ends up changing. One of the reasons why You get people saying those kinds of things. Why you have all of these leaders keep on going down this path is because there has been, whether it's an intentional or just the way it worked out process, you have a lot in the major media. You've heard Ian Puddock, the smartest man in London, talks about this a lot from the UK side, where he said all the major media are kind of lockstep behind what the British government wants, and they only tell one version of a story. No matter how disconnected from reality it is, they just keep on giving it. So it's the only narrative that the British people hear. Well, it's not quite that bad in the United States, but man, sometimes it is. And there was last night an interview by CBS News, 60 Minutes, the flagship of their news shows, that had, with Scott Pelley was talking to Volodymyr Zelensky. And in this conversation, it is as close to just outright propaganda as I may have seen in any one show. I mean, there's been a lot over the 3+ years of this war, but this is one of the worst, and especially coming this late in the war, I think it has to be the worst. Whether it's an intentional propaganda, whether it's just bad misinformation, bad journalism, I can't say, because I don't have enough information. I don't know what led them to say the things that they do. I can only speculate from outside. But what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that the stuff they say and the stuff they don't say leads to outright misinformation. So everybody who was watching that was either intentionally or whatever led to believe a certain truth, a certain state of facts, a certain state of the war. And if that's all they had, they are misinformed. And they may then be subject to wanting to support policies that will only harm more Ukrainians. That's the truth. But I'm going to show you several. We took several bites of this. I recommend you go watch the whole thing, so you see the whole thing in context. It's on CBS News. You can just Google that and find it with great ease. It's out there. I think it's about a 14-minute interview. I encourage you to go watch the whole thing, because we can't play the whole thing here, but I'm going to take these certain sound bites out. And I want anyone who has any question about whether any of the things I'm going to say about this, you can watch it yourself in context of the whole, and you can come to your own assessment, especially based on the reality that we know exists here. But we'll start with the first one, because this is where we know that this is either intentional propaganda or it's just bad journalism, because the introduction that Scott Pelley gives after all this time, now into the 4th year of the war, he is really off the mark.
The Ukrainian president faces a critical moment in his alliance with the United States. In an interview this past Friday, Volodymyr Zelensky invited President Trump here to Ukraine to see how Russia's unprovoked invasion 3 years ago continues to threaten the peace of the Western world.
Two huge statements that he made there, huge statements. Number one, he repeated the same thing that Biden said probably 5,000 times during his time in office: the unprovoked war against Ukraine. That's the common thing that he said there. No room for equivocation, no consideration that there may be other factors, not even as like, well, it's a little complicated, but I think this is the right one. Nothing, just a flat statement. It was unprovoked. And I'm saying, really, you call that unprovoked? What do you suggest that from the year 2007, when Vladimir Putin went to the Munich Security Conference and addressed the Western world and said, by the way, this whole thing about you wanting to go into Ukraine and NATO and give membership to those states, that's not going to fly. We consider that a grave threat. That's what he told them there. You go down that path, it's a grave threat. The next year, 2008, at the Bucharest summit, the NATO summit, NATO members by name specified Georgia and Ukraine will become a member of NATO. So they took whatever Putin said and said, yeah, I don't care that you consider that a grave threat. Not interested in your opinion. We're going to go do this because nobody tells us what to do. So that was the very first of the provocations. And then we had the events of 2013, 2014, where the legally elected government in Ukraine, which was leaning toward the Russian side in terms of its policies and security, et cetera, was overthrown with the support of the United States and others in Western Europe. And when there was a chance to have a negotiated settlement to end that violent situation that happened in the Maidan Square, you've probably heard some of that in the early part of 2014, the Russians, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians all came together and they said, all right, we're going to work out a deal where there's going to be new elections starting in May of that year. This is in February. In May of that year, we're going to have it. So we'll have early elections and you'll get a chance. So if you think your side was on the upside, if you think that the president who was elected at that time, who wanted to have more economic integration with Russia instead of the European Union, if you don't like that path, then you can go back to the ballot box then, and you can elect a new leader who will go down that path. Instead, our side, because we have intercepted telephone calls between Victoria Nuland and some of the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador at the time, we're actively working on already selecting who's going to be in charge of what. And it's, of course, then Russia calls them coup plotters, the people who were rising up against the legally elected government, then seized power. And then the elected president had to leave. So instead of going to the ballot box, they just took it, even though they would have certainly won. The Russians knew that they were going to lose the election and still were willing to go and say, we'll have the elections anyway, because then it's legal. So the Russia we always accuse of being not democratic and being authoritarian and stuff was willing to have an election that they supported that they knew almost certainly they would lose. But instead of doing that, we said, nope, we're going to go this way. We're going to take it. And it was after that Russia said, okay, I see that we can't trust you. I'm not going to trust the security of the Russian-speaking people in the Ukraine to that, especially in Crimea, where our naval base is, in Sevastopol, so that we're going to annex that. And they had this election. Some say it was a sham. Some say it was legitimate. Don't know. I don't have the personal knowledge to be able to say one way or the other. All I can say is that's exactly what did happen, and that's the reason why. So that was provoked as well. And then, of course, we had the Minsk agreements in 2015. And Russia forever just said, follow that Minsk agreement. The absolute heart of that agreement was that the Ukraine government would change its constitution so that it gave limited autonomy to the Luhansk and Donetsk republics and to the Russian speakers in the country. That was a non-negotiable from the Russian side. Everything else pinned it off of that. The Ukraine side never did it. We, of course, know subsequently that France and Germany, who were signatories to that, both said they never intended for Ukraine to actually abide by it. That's why they never put any pressure onto them. And then that led to the events heading into this war here. And this war even started because little known in the West, you'll know if you've watched our show, you'll know if you've seen Colonel Jacques Beau in previous episodes that we've had, chronicled how Ukraine, Zelensky himself, after he was elected in 2019, put in a law that said they're going to retake the areas that the Russians had annexed by force if necessary. That was a problem. Russia showed that that's not going to happen. And so they had this military buildup, which started in, I think, the very next month in April of 2021. And then it reached a peak in December 2021 when Putin came up with a new opportunity and said, all right, here's a new plan that we have, a new negotiated settlement, which is worse than the Minsk agreements, but still way better than anything else because it would have resulted in Russian troops withdrawing from the country. There wouldn't have ever been a war. We rejected every one of those. And then, of course, right before the war started, the Ukrainian military started shelling the areas in Ukraine, by the way. Remember, this was a civil war, and they started shelling with a much higher frequency the Russian-speaking population in the eastern part of Ukraine, and that was the trigger that Russia finally said, all right, that's it. There's no more talking. We're going into war. So you can say that Russia shouldn't have done that. You can say there was other alternatives, but what you cannot say is that it was unprovoked. You cannot say that if you're being honest at all. Pele said none of that. Everything that I just told you in this last segment here, he didn't even utter a word of it. Just said it was unprovoked, giving credence to the comment and the claims by so many in the West that Russia was just sitting there and just, I don't know, Putin just sitting there with his hands in his pocket one day and goes, you know what? I'm tired. Let's just go get them. Let's just go over there and steal all the Ukraine. That's what he's putting forth. And of course, that meets the narrative that the West wants, that is Russia is this authoritarian Hitler wannabe, evil, wicked. There's nothing good about them. They're all bad, etc. That makes it easy to hate them. And of course, that's exactly what has transpired to this day. Now, it's one thing if you're head of state and you're trying to have a narrative to meet your political outcome, but it should be a different thing if it's a media outlet. They're supposed to be the so-called fourth estate. That's the what keeps the government honest by saying, hey, we're just doing journalism here. This is what the truth is. Come to your own mind about what the policies are, whether they're right or wrong. But instead, he was outright supporting in his introductory comments there that this is the narrative that Zelensky believes in. Basically, Zelensky couldn't have had a better interview if he wrote the script for Pele himself. And it's so ironic because in the course of this, he's going to show, and I'm going to show you to you in a minute, where he's going to accuse the president of the United States and the vice president of coming under Russian propaganda and under Russian narratives, when the actual truth demonstrably is that it is CBS News that has come under the narrative of the president of Ukraine. That's the truth of it. And you'll see as we continue on through it. The other thing he says there that Pele said is this threatens Western security. That's something that Biden talked about a lot. It's something that Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, the leader in Poland periodically, several others, especially in the Baltics, they commonly refer to and say, yes, they're coming after us next, etc., which has never been the case. But perversely, the longer and the more the West goes down this path, the more you get the potential for self-fulfilling prophecy, where Russia comes to the conclusion, you guys are building up for war. We're going to have to fight you someday. So that wasn't the case before. Now it's actually on the table because we keep going with things that weren't true and just having this myth and passing it off as actual fact. Pele continues that path here and reinforces that that's what Russia's going to do. The next thing here is Pele's going to refer to something that happened on the April 4th in Kryvyi Rih, which was the hometown for Volodymyr Zelensky, where there was a bombing that resulted in the large number of children were killed at School 41.
School 41 was mourning its students killed on April 4th. Swing sets, pierced by shrapnel, stood where Zelensky laid his memorial to the 9 children and 10 others cut down by a Russian missile. He asked us to look at their faces and told us that while the great powers endlessly debate war and peace, these children will never speak again. Mr. President, what does an atrocity like this tell you about the progress of the war?
It means that we can't trust Russia. We can't trust negotiations with Russia.
Okay, a couple of big problems here as well. So you see Scott Pele just says, what does this atrocity tell you? Implying strongly that this was a Russian attempt, that they targeted children, that they fired these missiles just to kill a bunch of kids. That's the claim. And Zelensky's response here, I'll get to in a second. But let's actually examine, is that what happened? Because Russia has been very careful not to target civilians throughout this entire war. In fact, there have been sometimes where either an errant missile or actually sometimes it's not clear that they just went and attacked some things. They attacked some malls, especially early in the war, because the Ukraine side was using them, which was later validated by the evidence of the Ukrainian armored vehicles that were in the rubble that were seen afterwards. So it was proven that that was the case. But there have been some where it could well have been that Russia did attack them. So definitely not wanting to whitewash what the Russians have done. They may have done some of that, but it is very small because they could have done a lot more of that. They could have just absolutely turned to rubble Kiev, for example. In the area of the presidential palace, in some of the other military organizations, headquarters, etc., they've chosen not to do that. And I've often been surprised by that because, I mean, those are valid military targets, and yet they've chosen not to go after them. So then the thought here, did they now then, this late in the process where they're trying to bring the war to an end through negotiations, are they going to choose this moment to literally shoot kids, which is something that they otherwise say that they abhor? Well, what the Russian side is saying here is that this was actually in Kryvyi Rih. They actually attacked and destroyed a large formation of foreign fighters who were meeting with some Ukrainian military in I think it was a hotel, or there was some other facility that they had attacked, that they said that they succeeded, and they claimed that they got it. And then the claim further is that one of the air defense missiles that was trying to shoot down the Russian missiles misfired, or else it just went astray, didn't hit the target, and then landed on the civilians there. Now, again, I can't tell you for sure which one it is, but the problem is you have Pele saying things like this, as in the Western media so far, is that anytime something happens, there's not even the examination of here's what the Ukraine side's saying, here's what the Russian side is saying, here's the evidence as best that we can piece together. There's never any of that at all. It's just, yep, Russia is evil and wicked because that's the narrative that we want to have, and that's what happened here. So it's just stated as a matter of fact. Again, to reiterate, I don't know. And for all I know, it is possible that the Russians either mistargeted something or maybe they were just being evil that day and decided to do it. I can't say for sure, but I can tell you the evidence doesn't imply that that's what happened. It needs to be investigated independently, not with a Ukrainian or a CBS News team, but with some kind of independent authority to find out exactly what happened. Almost certainly that won't happen, because if it turns out to be that it was an errant Ukrainian missile, and by the way, that has happened many, many times throughout this war, that the Ukrainian anti-air defense missile systems missed the target and hit its own people. That happened a bunch in here. So there is a lot of precedence for that too. One of the other things here, back to the diplomatic track that's problematic, is that Pele asked Zelensky, what is the consequence of this missile attack here? And he said, well, it means you can't trust Putin. So we can't have a negotiated settlement because we can't trust him. Okay, hang on. So you're telling me that right now, see, that was Friday. That was last Friday. You're telling me that while President Trump has been trying to negotiate an end to this war and has had a lot of shuttle diplomacy, they've met with you in Kiev, they met with you in Saudi Arabia, they met with the Russians several times, they met with the Russians in Russia. All this shuttle diplomacy is going on. And now you're telling me out loud, I can't trust Russia. I can't have a negotiated settlement. What does that leave? If you don't have a negotiated settlement, if you hate the Russian side, and he does, that was also part of this interview where he just said, oh yeah, I hate Putin with 100%, not 99.99%, but 100% hate, then you can't have any kind of negotiated settlement that's going to end in anything besides a loss. And listen, let me just categorically state again, militarily, the war is already resolved. The outcome is already known. The Russians won. The only thing still to be determined is how bad the loss is going to be. And right now, with Zelensky making statements like this, that means the loss is going to be worse. But Pele didn't even mention that. He didn't even talk about the ramifications. It didn't even dawn on him that if there's no negotiations, then these kinds of attacks will keep happening, that the soldiers at the front line will keep getting killed. It's like he's oblivious to it. It's like he's wedded to the narrative. And so all we want to do is talk about the narrative and forget about the actual facts and the Ukrainian people dying as a result. That's what drives me crazy, because in the attempt to say, yes, Russia's this evil one, by your own actions, you're getting more Ukrainians killed. Who's the evil one here from the Ukrainian perspective? I argue that Russia's firing a lot of these missiles, so they deserve some of the blame, but who is enabling them by continuing the war going on the other side? Very much a provocation situation here. There's not a lot of empty hands, clean hands here. Next, I want to go on now. Okay, so that was one thing where it was about Putin. Now then we shift to the president of the United States. So Pele makes the claim here, just a statement, that Trump has rewritten history.
Then Trump rewrote history, saying falsely that Ukraine had started the war and calling the democratically elected Zelensky
a dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast, or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast, because that war is going in the wrong direction.
When President Trump called you a dictator and said that Ukraine started this war, what did you think?
Я вважаю, що, на жаль, русські наративи.
I believe, sadly, Russian narratives are prevailing in the U.S.
Як можна бачити?
How is it possible to witness our losses and our suffering, to understand what the Russians are doing, and to still believe that they are not the aggressors, that they did not start this war?
See, now in the beginning of this war, when Putin himself said that Russia started, that the Ukraine side started this war, it was just mocked on the Western side without any further examination, because everybody's like going, obviously the Russian tanks rolled in on February 24th of 2022. They kind of started the war, and then they just stopped it right there. And no one in the West, or very few, paid any attention to what Putin responded. He actually responded to those. And he said, listen, I'm not talking about February 24th, 2022. I'm talking about 2013. I'm talking about even before that, during what they call the coup, where we helped support the overthrow of the legally elected government. That's what he's talking about. That's where he said this started. And then it turned into a civil war. And by the way, this civil war was almost all against the Russian-speaking ethnic Ukrainians living in Ukraine that were of Russian ethnic background, that spoke Russian, etc. That's what he was talking about. And he said that he tried to do, from the Putin's perspective, he tried to negotiate a settlement with the Minsk Accords. He tried to have these negotiations, and then it wouldn't happen, of course. And as I mentioned a minute ago, starting in March, I want to say March the 7th, it could have been the 11th of 2021, when Zelensky signed this declaration that said they were going to return these temporarily occupied territories by whatever means necessary. And he basically said, yeah, look, not only is there still the line of contact, because there had been an 8-year civil war, or nearly an 8-year up to that point. Not only had that been, but they started increasing the shelling against the Ukrainian people of Russian descent on that side of the line of contact. And so Russia said, no, we're not going to do that. I'm going to put pressure. I'm going to put all these troops on the border as a warning and a signal. Don't do that. But they didn't go on with it. So you still keep circling back to that. It's kind of like the unprovoked nature of it. And so when Russia says that they started, this is what he's talking about. You started shelling the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. It's a fact. It's not an assumption. You don't have to take anybody's word for it. That's just a fact. Over the 8 years, there was going back and forth on both sides. That's certainly true as well. But you can't say that this was all the Russian side and they did nothing. And it wasn't the Russians who signed that law in March 2021, and then who started moving military forces closer to the line of contact. That wasn't Russia. They're countering it, and you can see their military buildup came a month after that declaration. So hardly anybody in the West knows this. Scott Pelley either doesn't know it, doesn't want to know it. I don't know, but he's continuing the narrative going on down there. But now then we turn to President Trump. And he says, unfortunately, it just looks like Trump is a victim of Moscow propaganda. And this is where it starts to get kind of weird, frankly. Because I assure you, President Trump, I know for certain he is very well aware of the facts. He's very well aware of all the things I just mentioned. He knows. And so he's making these calculations and decisions and statements based on knowledge of the comprehensive truth. And you saw in that video clip I played at the top of this show, President Trump said there's blame to go around all over the place. Russia did some things wrong. Ukraine did some things wrong. They shouldn't have had this started all. The U.S. shouldn't have supported all this war, et cetera. Now we're going to bring it to an end. So he is well aware. His eyes are open. And then you have this propaganda from the CBS News that's not at all. And Pelley doesn't even give the possibility, never ask a second or third follow-on question to Zelensky. Well, what about this, Mr. President? President Trump says this, but you say that he's following propaganda, but here are the other facts. What do you say to that? Never ask the question. And then didn't stop with the president. Then both Pelley and Zelensky want to turn their fire on the vice president.
It seems to me that the vice president is somehow justifying Putin's actions. I tried to explain. You can't look for something in the middle. There is an aggressor and there is a victim. The Russians are the aggressor and we are the victim. Vice President Vance suggested that Putin could be trusted, and it was Zelensky who was creating a false narrative.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring people, you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President.
Would you invite President Trump to Ukraine?
With pleasure. Please.
This, Zelensky apparently wanted President Trump to hear in English.
We want you to come, and I think to come and to see. You think you understand what's going on here. Okay, we respect your position. You understand. But please, before any kind of decisions, any kind of formats of negotiations, come to see people, civilians, warriors, hospitals, churches, children, destroyed or dead. Come, look, and then let's move with a plan how to finish the war.
That that is, I want to say the height of arrogance, but I mean, it's been broached a lot of times, so it's another one. It's another of the extremely arrogant suggestions. Zelensky is actually saying, and I think based on his body language and his facial expressions, that he believes what he's saying there. He actually thinks, if I can just get Trump here, then I'll be able to show him stuff on the ground that will somehow prove that Russia was the aggressor. You know, when they're talking about schools and churches and hospitals and all this kind of stuff. You know, funny that he didn't ask, and odd that it's not really odd that Pele never said, by the way, you know, a lot of the things that the vice president said there. What is it about the charge that you say about that you banned all the political parties that you don't like, that you refuse to have an election, that your constitution says, yeah, you can have martial law, but that also at some point you have to have an election. And by the way, the United States during our Civil War had an election. So what is it about that you can't do? Why will you not have an election? And, you know, several other kinds of questions along those same lines here. What about all of the churches that you have shut down? What about the people that you have literally put in jail because they say anything against your government? What is it about all these mobilizations where you violate your own laws and literally steal people off the streets in the thousands each month? What about all those? How does that match with being the best democracy? You know, of course, he didn't ask any of those questions, and he just wants to paint Zelensky as this innocent victim who's just trying to do the best he can. But instead, we go down the path of it's the president who's just misinformed. Instead of asking a single one of those questions or even bringing it up, he's allowing the impression of that segment to be that the president and the vice president of the United States are both duped by the Russians and just giving their narratives, as opposed to, dang, maybe he's actually just looking at what's happening on the ground and says, hey, there's a lot of problems here, and we don't have any answers to them. But then the consequence of that, you see, was in the last portion of that segment there, where he says, listen, I want Trump to come so that then we can find a plan how to win the war or how to succeed in the war. And there is no plan. This is not something that can be found. The President Biden and his team and all of Europe, all of NATO, 50 nations we bragged about relentlessly, did everything in their power to find a solution to the war. One never was found. It continues to get Ukrainians killed and territory lost. That's what it happens when you ignore that calculation that President Trump talked about at the beginning, the Luke 14 comment that I put up right following that. If you don't do the calculations and see that one side has this power, your side has that power, make a deal to end it. Stop the senseless slaughter. Instead, nobody in the West wants to think about that, whether it's the Europeans, the previous administration, or the media. They just keep gearing these things. And of course, if Americans, if they don't watch our show, they probably don't know any of the things that I said there. And they may be tempted to think, especially if they're the Democratic persuasion, they'll be saying, yeah, no, why don't we do that? Yeah, why won't Trump go down there? Trump doesn't need to go down there because that would be a political victory, a PR victory, rather, for Zelensky. Well, it might be. I rather think that Trump could go in there and actually end up saying, yeah, that convinced me that I'm doing the right thing and you're crazy. You know, maybe that would be the case. But I doubt very seriously whether Trump's going to do anything that Zelensky tells him to do. But either way, it's not going to make any difference because there's just no reality on the Ukraine side. There's no reality on the media side in the West. And I have just kind of scanned the news since that came out last night. I haven't done it in depth, but I've not seen anybody that has said Pele forgot to ask all of these different questions and didn't raise any of these things. They're just reporting what was said in the segment, which will again allow people to believe that those things are true, that those charges are true, that those claims are true. And they're not going to know about all of the categories of things I've told you about that weren't even mentioned in the segment, all of which has to do with how this war is going to end. But then we got down toward the end of the segment, and without question, the worst thing at all that bodes the most ill for where this is going to go came when Pele asked him, how does President Zelensky see the war ending?
What does a just peace look like to you?
Безумовно, не втратити нашу суверенітет і нашу...
To not lose our sovereignty, or our independence. We, no matter what, will take back what is ours, because we never lost it. The Russians took it from us, the temporarily occupied territories. We will not recognize as Russia those territories that the Russians temporarily occupy. We will bring them back. When or how, I cannot say.
So you want a just and lasting peace? That was the question it was asked. What does a just peace look like? It's one of the questions I ask a lot. Recently, we've gotten some answers here, which we put on the channel. But now here's Scott Pelley getting it from the man himself. What does Zelensky think is a just and lasting peace? And he said it's one where we maintain our sovereignty, where we maintain our military, where we maintain our territory. And I'm not going to agree to anything we're not going to acknowledge that we lost any of the territory to Russia, and that in any case, and eventually we'll get it back to our in the future. Don't know how, but we'll get it back somewhere. So what you were telling Russia unequivocally is there is no negotiating with this man. There is no deal that he can make. There is no concessions that they can give, because what Zelensky is asking President Putin to do is surrender. He's asking him to say, I will set the terms for a negotiated settlement. It will be what I decide and only what I decide. And I'm going to have this big reassurance force that's going to be part of that. I'm going to bring a bunch of people in from the West. We're going to continue to build. As soon as we get the fighting stopped, we're going to build our forces back up. We're going to keep getting support from Europe well into the future. They promised stuff up through 2030. And then later on, when I'm capable, or when the future president is capable, then we'll take them back. Don't know how, but we're going to do that. That's what you have just told Russia. Now, it doesn't even matter at this point what Steve Witkoff can say, what the Secretary of State Rubio can say, anybody, President Trump himself. If Putin says, you got to get this guy under control, because who am I going to sign a deal with? Am I going to sign a deal with that guy on his terms when I have the military advantage? He's not going to have it. You have just told the Russians, forget about what Trump is saying and just fight until you take what you want, so that there's no demilitarization, denazification. Nobody has to willingly withdraw from any areas, as there was some concern just the last week or so from the Ukraine side. You don't have to worry about that. Russia will simply seize it by force, even if it takes them another year of fighting. You had Colonel Mark Reisner of the Austrian forces in an interview with the new Zurich Zeitung, the newspaper, this morning, I believe it was. He said, listen, you just got to look. Russia thinks that this is like April 1945 and they're about to win the war. They have the military power to do it. And by the way, all evidence shows that they can continue at the current rate of expenditure, both of manpower and equipment, ammunition, et cetera, for 2 more years. Easy. 2 more years. Ukraine will be lucky if it makes it through another couple of, if it makes it to the middle of the summer, I will be shocked. But in any case, there is a finite number of Ukrainian men, and that number dwindles by the day. And with the United States not even offering to have any other additional support, and with the European Union saying, here's 1/3 of what the U.S. alone gave last year, and that'll be spread out between now and 2030, means it's going to be minuscule. You won't have a fraction of enough ammunition, weapons, anything else, or manpower. It is inevitable that at some point the Ukraine military just collapse, and it loses the ability to have a coherent defense. And at some point, the Russians will be able to drive into the country. That's what you're setting the stage for. You're telling Russia that's your only play here. So congratulations, Scott Pelley. Well done, CBS News. You have helped enable the defeat of Ukraine. That is the most likely outcome that's going to be happening now, based upon these and many other comments. Zelensky said some other things over the weekend that just added some weight to this. But just for the moment, in the last few minutes we have here, just for the moment, put yourself in Russia's position. Forget about whether you like them or hate them. It's irrelevant. But if you were on their side and you had the military superiority, even better example, let's say that you are who you are. You're the United States. And we see that the Russians or Chinese, one or the other, had been trying to do some kind of a deal in Mexico on our southern border here. And they tried something that's not going to work. And so they tried to do something, but our military power was enough, and we started pushing them back. And then now we have the decisive advantage, and we can either close the gap and close those jaws for the military victory, or we can have a negotiated settlement where they recognize that they can't do what they're doing anymore. They can't have the Russians or Chinese there. And they say, yeah, I don't want to. I don't care. I want you to do what I want. I want you to just give me what I want to my security and to allow me to keep my military forces there, and then sure, we'll quit fighting. I mean, they would get laughed out of town. That wouldn't give nobody in America would give that any serious consideration. They would say, "Are you crazy? Have you lost your mind? What planet are you living on? Do you think that we're going to sign a deal from a position of military superiority with anybody on the Mexican side and a foreign adversary, and we're going to allow you to keep getting weapons and everything else, and then build up, and you may try again to seize part of the southern United States?" It's beyond question what we would do. Then why do you think the Russians would be any different than we would be under the same circumstances? It's irrational to think that Russia would agree to that. Again, take the morality out of it, because let me be blunt here. The war doesn't give a damn about your morality or my morality or what anybody thinks is right or wrong or anything. It only cares about power. It only cares about the balance of power, who can and who can't do something, who can compel a certain outcome and who can't prevent a certain outcome. That's what it cares about. And that's how wars have always been for thousands of years. This one's no different. And that's where we are. And the more that we try to pretend that we can have PR messages and we can make people think certain things, and that'll somehow translate into the reality on the ground and how a settlement comes out, it's fantasy, folks. And it's self-defeating, self-harming fantasy as well. It is time, way beyond time, that we need to just acknowledge reality, get this war over with by the least offensive terms possible, and then get about to setting about trying to remove any potential threats for future conflict between the East and the West, between Russia and Europe, or Russia and the United States for that matter. That's what needs to predominate right now, because if we keep going down this path too far, we may find that whether by accident, a miscalculation, an error, any number of things could cause this thing to continue to spiral on. Every day the war continues on, the risk, however small, remains that something unexpected could happen that could cause this thing to flame up into areas beyond the Ukrainian borders. And that would serve no one's interest. Not the Ukrainians, not the West, not the Russians. I know you don't care about the Russians, neither do I. I care about the Ukrainian people, I care about Europe, and I care about the United States. That's what we need to do if we want to prevent a bigger catastrophe than what we've already had. That, my friend, is the truth. Thank you very much for watching with us today. Like always, we're unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, whatever it is, because you deserve to know. Not like some of the stuff you're seeing on mainstream media. We're bringing you the whole truth, and you can make your decisions accordingly. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.